December 18, 1940. The Berghof, Obersalzberg, Bavarian Alps. Snow drifts silently against the panoramic windows of Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat, sealing the room in a cold, white isolation. Inside the cavernous study, the air is thick with cigar smoke and the heavy scent of pine. Despite the purity of the mountain air outside, General Wilhelm Keitel stands rigidly by the heavy oak table, his eyes tracing the red lines drawn across a massive map of Eastern Europe. Hitler, leaning over the parchment with a magnifying glass, does not look up as he picks up a fountain pen. With a quick, jagged scrawl, he signs Führer Directive 21, a document that seals the fate of millions. This directive creates a strategic pivot that will ultimately doom the Third Reich, shifting the German war machine's focus from the unfinished conquest of Britain to the vast, frozen plains of the Soviet Union. The plan, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, calls for a rapid campaign to crush Soviet Russia before the onset of winter. The strategic objective is not merely territorial conquest, but the total annihilation of the Bolshevik state and the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space. For the German people, the document explicitly states that the bulk of the Russian army stationed in Western Russia is to be destroyed in daring operations involving deep penetrations by armored spearheads. The ideological foundation for this invasion has been festering in Hitler's mind for nearly 2 decades, written plainly in the pages of Mein Kampf. To the Nazi leadership, the pact signed with Stalin in 1939 was nothing more than a temporary tactical convenience, a piece of paper designed to keep the Soviet Union dormant while Germany dismantled France and Poland. Now, with the Wehrmacht victorious in the West, the Führer believes the time has come to turn east and fulfill Germany's supposed destiny. He views the Slavic people as subhuman and the Soviet political system as a fragile structure that will collapse under the first heavy blow. In the high-ceilinged war rooms of the Oberkommando des Heeres OKH in Zossen, the mood is one of dangerous overconfidence bordering on arrogance. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch and his chief of staff, Franz Halder, analyze the intelligence reports with a dismissive wave of the hand. They have just orchestrated the most spectacular military victory in modern history by defeating the French army in 6 weeks, a feat that convinced them of their own invincibility. Halder notes in his diary that the Russian campaign will be won in less than 3 months, believing the Wehrmacht will slice through the Red Army like a hot knife through butter. However, the intelligence pictures upon which these confident generals rely are fatally flawed and dangerously incomplete. The German intelligence agency, the Abwehr, has severely underestimated the Soviet Union's industrial capacity and military reserves. They estimate that Stalin can field perhaps 200 divisions, a number the Germans feel confident they can encircle and destroy near the border. They have absolutely no knowledge of the hundreds of reserve divisions being mobilized deep in the Urals and Siberia, nor do they know about the new generation of Soviet weaponry. The T-34 tank, a war machine that will soon terrorize German panzer crews, does not appear on any German assessment charts. The logistical planning for Operation Barbarossa is a nightmare of geography and physics that the German General Staff chooses to ignore. The distance from the Polish border to Moscow is roughly 600 miles, a vast expanse of forests, swamps, and primitive infrastructure. Unlike the paved roads of Western Europe, the Soviet Union possesses few hard-surface highways, relying instead on dirt tracks that turn into impassable rivers of mud during the rains. Furthermore, the Russian railway gauge is wider than the German standard, meaning the Wehrmacht cannot simply use captured trains to resupply their front lines without tedious conversion efforts. Economic planners like General Georg Thomas warn that the Wehrmacht cannot be supplied with fuel and food from Germany for such a long campaign. The solution proposed by the Nazi leadership is as ruthless as it is practical. The army must live off the land. This strategy, known grimly as the Hunger Plan, explicitly calculates that tens of millions of Soviet citizens will starve to death as the German army seizes their grain and livestock. It is a logistical strategy built on the premise of mass murder, ensuring that the coming war will not be a conventional conflict but a war of extermination. As the spring of 1941 arrives, an unexpected crisis in the Balkans threatens to derail the carefully calculated timeline of the invasion. Mussolini's botched invasion of Greece forces Hitler to intervene, diverting elite panzer divisions south to crush Yugoslavia and Greece in Operation Marita. While the campaign is a tactical success, securing the southern flank of Europe, it consumes precious weeks of good weather. The start date for Barbarossa is pushed back from May to late June, a delay that seems insignificant in the warmth of spring, but will have catastrophic consequences when the first snows fall in November. By early June, the build-up along the eastern frontier reaches a scale unprecedented in the history of human warfare. Over 3 million German soldiers, along with 600,000 troops from allied nations like Romania and Finland, assemble in the forests of East Prussia and occupied Poland. They bring with them 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and over 2,000 aircraft. This massive force is divided into 3 great army groups: north, tasked with taking Leningrad, center, aiming for Moscow, and south, directed toward the economic riches of Ukraine and the Caucasus oil fields. The soldiers waiting in the assembly areas are a mix of battle-hardened veterans from the French campaign and fresh recruits eager to prove themselves. They polish their boots and check their weapons, confident that they will be home before the leaves turn brown. Letters written home reveal a supreme faith in the Führer and a belief that the Eastern hordes are no match for German discipline and technology. Propaganda companies churn out newsreels depicting the Soviet Union as a primitive wasteland awaiting the civilizing hand of German culture, reinforcing the racial indoctrination that permeates the ranks. Darker orders are circulating among the officer corps, instructions that strip away the last veneer of military honor. The Commissar order dictates that Soviet political officers are not to be treated as prisoners of war but are to be executed immediately upon capture. Another directive absolves German soldiers of any crimes committed against Soviet civilians, effectively granting a license for murder and pillage. These orders ensure that the Soviet resistance will be absolute and desperate, as the enemy realizes that surrender offers no guarantee of survival. The war is designed to be criminal from its very inception. On the other side of the border, Joseph Stalin refuses to believe the mounting evidence of the impending German attack. He receives dozens of warnings from intelligence agents, including the master spy Richard Sorge in Tokyo, who provides the exact date of the invasion. Even Winston Churchill and American intelligence try to warn the Kremlin, but Stalin dismisses these reports as British provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into a war against Germany. He is so terrified of provoking Hitler that he forbids his generals from placing frontline units on high alert, leaving them vulnerable and exposed. In the final days before the attack, the noise of the German buildup becomes impossible to hide. The rumble of thousands of tank engines, the screech of train wheels carrying ammunition, and the drone of reconnaissance aircraft fill the air along the border. German commando units, dressed in civilian clothes or Soviet uniforms, begin to slip across the frontier to sabotage communication lines and seize key bridges. Yet, the Soviet border guards are under strict orders not to fire, watching through their binoculars with growing dread as the steel storm gathers on the western horizon. The night of June 21, 1941, is short, marking the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. In the German assembly areas, the code word Dortmund is transmitted, signaling that the invasion is a go. The soldiers are issued their basic load of ammunition and rations, and the engines of the tanks are warmed up, spitting blue smoke into the twilight. Chaplains hold field services, blessing the troops and their weapons. While commanders go over the maps one last time, the tension is palpable, a physical weight pressing down on millions of men who are about to unleash hell on earth. At the Brest-Litovsk fortress, a key Soviet stronghold on the Bug River, the garrison sleeps, unaware that they are in the crosshairs of heavy German artillery. A heavy train rumbles across the bridge, heading west into German territory. Carrying Soviet grain, the last shipment of raw materials Stalin is sending to Hitler under the terms of their economic agreement. The irony of this final delivery is lost in the darkness. The train disappears into the night, the clatter of its wheels fading into a silence that feels heavy and unnatural. It is 3:00 a.m. on June 22. Along an 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, thousands of German artillery officers check their watches, watching the second hand sweep toward the top of the dial. The world holds its breath. The diplomatic charade is over. The treaties are worthless. And the greatest military clash in history is seconds away. Lieutenant Robert Miller, though not present here, would recognize the feeling in the pit of his stomach, the unmistakable sensation of a roller coaster cresting the highest peak before the plunge. The order is given FOIA. At exactly 0315 on June 22, 1941, the eastern horizon erupts in a blinding flash of artificial lightning as thousands of German artillery pieces fire simultaneously. The ground shakes with a rhythmic, sickening thud that travels for miles through the soles of the soldiers' boots, shattering the pre-dawn silence of the Russian frontier. For the Soviet border guards peering into the gloom, the world dissolves into a chaotic inferno of shrapnel and dirt before they can even reach for their rifles. The barrage is so intense and concentrated that it severs telephone lines and destroys command bunkers in the first few minutes, effectively decapitating the Red Army's communication network before the first German boot crosses the line. Overhead, the sky buzzes with the drone of the Luftwaffe as Field Marshal Albert Kesselring unleashes his air fleets to execute a devastating preemptive strike. Swarms of Messerschmitt fighters and Junkers dive bombers swarm over Soviet airfields, catching the Red Air Force asleep on the tarmac. Rows of Polikarpov fighters, lined up wingtip to wingtip, as if for inspection, are turned into burning skeletons of wood and canvas without ever leaving the ground. By noon of the first day, the Luftwaffe claims to have destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, a number so high that Hermann Göring initially refuses to believe the reports until they are verified by ground observers. On the ground, the German panzer divisions roar to life, their engines screaming as they surge forward across pontoon bridges thrown hastily over the Bug River. General Heinz Guderian, the master of armored warfare, leads Panzer Group 2 with a characteristic aggression, standing in his command vehicle and urging his tanks forward into the dust. The German doctrine of blitzkrieg is on full display here, as the armored spearheads bypass strong points of resistance, leaving them for the infantry to handle, while the tanks drive deep into the enemy rear to sow panic and confusion. The speed of the advance is breathtaking, with some units covering 50 miles in a single day. Inside the Soviet command posts, the situation is one of absolute paralysis and disbelief. Frustrated radio operators scream into their headsets, begging for orders that never come, while reports of German tanks appearing dozens of miles behind the lines flood in. When desperate commanders finally manage to reach Moscow by telephone, they are met with skepticism or conflicting orders. As Stalin initially believes the attack is merely a rogue provocation by German generals, frontline units are ordered not to fire back to avoid escalating the conflict, a command that results in the slaughter of thousands of confusion-stricken Soviet soldiers who stand frozen as the Wehrmacht rolls over them. However, amidst the collapse, pockets of fanatical resistance begin to emerge, offering the Germans a grim preview of the war to come. At the Brest Fortress, a 19th-century citadel right on the border, the Soviet garrison refuses to surrender despite being completely surrounded and cut off from supply. For days, and then weeks, the defenders fight from the cellars and the ruins, turning every room into a fortress and forcing the Germans to burn them out with flamethrowers and heavy explosives. This is not the refined surrender of the French army. This is a brutal, fight-to-the-death struggle that shocks the German infantrymen who expected a quick capitulation. Despite these isolated acts of heroism, the tactical situation for the Red Army is catastrophic. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, executes a massive pincer movement designed to trap the Soviet forces defending Belorussia. The two armored arms of the German offensive, led by Hoth and Guderian, slice through the disorganized Soviet lines and meet just west of Minsk on June 27. Inside this massive cauldron, or Kessel, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers are trapped, cut off from retreat and pounded by artillery and airstrikes until they have no choice but to surrender or die. The sheer scale of the prisoners captured at Minsk creates a logistical crisis for the Wehrmacht, which is unprepared to feed or guard such a massive number of men. Columns of dusty, exhausted Soviet prisoners stretching for miles shuffle westward, many of them wounded and starving. The The German guards, viewing their captives through the lens of Nazi racial ideology, treat them with callous brutality, often shooting those who fall behind or struggle to keep pace. This creates a terrifying reality for the Soviet soldier. Surrender is not a guarantee of safety, but often a slow sentence of death, a realization that will stiffen resistance in the months to come. While the panzers race ahead, the German infantry marches on foot, struggling to keep up with the mechanized spearheads in the stifling summer heat. The roads of Russia, unlike the paved highways of France, are dirt tracks that the passage of thousands of vehicles churns into fine, choking dust. This dust penetrates everything: engines, weapons, lungs, coating the soldiers in a grey, spectral powder that makes their eyes sting and their throats roar. As the infantry slogs forward, marching 20 to 30 miles a day, the vastness of the Russian landscape begins to dawn on them. The horizon seems to never get closer, stretching out endlessly into the east. In Berlin, and at the Wolf's Lair headquarters, the mood is one of premature jubilation. On July 3, General Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff, writes in his diary that it is not an exaggeration to say that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days. The German High Command looks at the maps, sees the destruction of entire Soviet armies, and assumes the Soviet state is collapsing. They believe that once the border battles are won, the road to Moscow will be a simple victory parade. They begin to discuss diverting tank groups to other objectives, thinking the main threat has been neutralized. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the silence from the Kremlin finally breaks. After retreating to his dacha in a state of nervous collapse for several days, Joseph Stalin re-emerges to address the nation on July 3. His voice is trembling, and he can be heard drinking water nervously between sentences. But his message marks a crucial shift in tone. He addresses the Soviet people not as comrades, but as brothers and sisters, appealing to Russian nationalism rather than communist ideology. He calls for a great patriotic war and orders a scorched earth policy, demanding that nothing of value, no grain, no fuel, no railway stock be left for the invader. As July wears on, the German advance continues, but the friction of war begins to accumulate. The engines of the tanks, designed for the moderate distances of Western Europe, begin to break down under the strain of the dust and the endless miles. Air filters clog, tracks snap, and oil consumption skyrockets, forcing the logistics columns to struggle frantically to keep the armored beasts fed. The supply lines are stretching dangerously thin, and the partisan activity in the rear areas, though currently disorganized, begins to nip at the heels of the Wehrmacht, forcing them to divert combat troops to guard supply depots. The German soldiers also encounter a terrifying surprise on the battlefield: the T-34 and KV-1 tanks. Near the town of Rasenii, a single Soviet KV-1 heavy tank blocks the advance of an entire German battle group for a full day. German anti-tank shells simply bounce off its thick armor, leaving the crews watching in horror as the monster destroys their vehicles one by one. It takes an 88mm anti-aircraft gun brought down to ground level and fired at point-blank range to finally knock it out. This technological shock sends ripples through the German Panzer Arm, which realizes its equipment is technically inferior to the best Soviet designs. Despite these tactical shocks, Army Group Center pushes relentlessly toward the next major objective, Smolensk. This city sits on the land bridge between the Dwina and Dnieper rivers, the traditional invasion route to Moscow taken by Napoleon in 1812. The fighting here becomes a confused, bloody brawl as the Soviets throw fresh reserves into the battle, trying desperately to plug the gap. The Germans execute another massive encirclement, trapping another 300,000 Soviet troops. But this time the pocket is porous. Many Soviet units manage to slip out at night through the forests and swamps to fight again, suggesting the German grip is slipping. By the end of July, the initial euphoria of the German High Command begins to be replaced by a creeping unease. The casualty lists are growing longer. Germany has already lost more men in 6 weeks of fighting in Russia than in the entire French campaign. The intelligence estimates of 200 Soviet divisions have proven wildly inaccurate. The Germans destroy a division only to find a fresh one taking its place a week later. Halder notes gloomily in his diary that they have underestimated the Russian colossus. admitting that for every dozen divisions they destroy, the Russians simply field another dozen. The strategic dilemma now facing Hitler is critical: maintain the drive on Moscow or divert forces to secure the flanks. Army Group North is bogging down in the swamps outside Leningrad, and Army Group South is struggling to encircle Kiev, where a massive concentration of Soviet troops threatens the German right flank. The generals, particularly Guderian and Halder, argue passionately for an immediate strike on Moscow, believing that capturing the capital will decapitate the Soviet regime. They argue that the center of gravity is the city itself, the hub of the rail network and the political heart of the enemy. Hitler, however, disagrees with his generals, focusing instead on economic targets. He eyes the grain of the Ukraine and the coal of the Donbass region, arguing that Germany needs these resources to sustain the war effort. He views the generals' obsession with Moscow as old-fashioned thinking, devoid of economic reality. This disagreement leads to a fateful delay, a period of indecision where the panzers sit idle or are sent on long marches south, consuming fuel and time while the summer sun beats down. The golden days of July and August are ticking away, and the Wehrmacht stands at a crossroads that will decide the outcome of the war. As the dust settles over the battlefields of Smolensk, the German soldier looks at his map and realizes the terrifying truth of the geography. They have advanced 400 miles and won spectacular victories, yet Moscow is still 200 miles away. The Soviet Union has not collapsed. It has merely absorbed the blow and is bleeding the Wehrmacht white with every mile gained. The days are beginning to get slightly shorter, the nights a little cooler. The summer of giants has been a triumph of arms. But the war is far from over, and the shadow of the coming autumn looms large over the exhausted men of the Ostfront. August 1941 brings a stifling heat to the headquarters of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, mirroring the rising temperature of the arguments inside the conference room. The German campaign has reached a critical strategic crossroads, leading to a bitter dispute that threatens to tear the High Command apart. On one side stands General Franz Halder and the field commanders, who argue with desperate urgency that the Wehrmacht must strike immediately for Moscow before the winter sets in. They believe the Soviet capital is the head of the snake: cut it off, and the body dies. On the other side sits Adolf Hitler, whose eyes are fixed not on the political center, but on the economic resources of the Ukraine to the south. Hitler overrides his generals with a tirade that dismisses their classical military training as obsolete, calling them knights of a bygone era who do not understand the economics of modern war. He issues Directive 33, ordering the center of the German line to halt its drive on Moscow and divert its armored strength south to encircle Soviet forces near Kiev. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer Force, flies personally to the Wolf's Lair to protest, arguing that diverting his tanks will cost them the one thing they cannot recover: time. Hitler listens, then lectures Guderian on the grain of Ukraine and the oil of the Caucasus until the general, defeated by the Führer's stubbornness, returns to his command to execute the order he knows is a mistake. The resulting operation is a tactical masterpiece that astounds the world but fatally wounds the German strategic timeline. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group turns south, driving hundreds of miles to link up with General Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, cutting behind the Soviet southwest front. The movement is executed with brutal precision, catching the Soviet commanders completely off guard, as they had expected the Germans to continue their drive toward Moscow. The steel jaws of the German pincers snap shut east of Kiev in mid-September, trapping a staggering number of Soviet troops in a pocket of annihilation that defies comprehension. Inside the Kiev pocket, the scene is apocalyptically grim, as nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers are squeezed into an ever-shrinking cauldron of death. The commander of the Soviet Southwest Front, Colonel General Mikhail Kirponos, attempts to organize a breakout but is killed in action, his body left in a nameless ravine. The sheer scale of the prisoner haul over 665,000 men surpasses any victory in military history. German newsreels triumphantly show endless columns of broken men marching west, proof of the Wehrmacht's invincibility. To the casual observer, it seems the Soviet Union has received its death blow, its armies dissolving under the hammer of the German offensive. However, as the celebrations echo in Berlin, the calendar on the wall tells a different, Far more ominous story. It is now late September, and the precious weeks of summer fighting weather have been squandered in the dust of the Ukraine. The diversion to Kiev has consumed nearly 6 weeks of operational time, weeks that the Germans will desperately miss when the mercury begins to drop. While the Germans were busy winning a tactical victory in the south, the Soviet High Command has used the respite to fortify the approaches to Moscow, digging miles of anti-tank ditches and bringing up fresh reserves. The German victory is spectacular, but it is a Pyrrhic triumph measured in lost time. With Kiev secured, the Wehrmacht finally pivots back to its original objective, launching Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, on October 2, 1941. At first, it seems that the delay might not matter, as the German armour once again smashes through the Soviet lines at Vyazma and Bryansk. Another 600,000 Soviet troops are encircled, and panic grips the streets of Moscow. Government offices are evacuated to Kuibyshev, and smoke rises from the courtyards of the Kremlin as secret documents are hastily burned. The German spearheads are now fewer than 100 miles from the capital, and officers are already dusting off their dress uniforms for the victory parade in Red Square. Then, the weather breaks, not with snow, but with the autumn rains that herald the arrival of the Rasputitsa, the season of the mud without roads. The dirt tracks that serve as the arteries of Russia dissolve overnight into quagmires of thick, glutinous slime that can swallow a boot, a wheel, or an entire truck. The German advance, predicated on speed and mobility, grinds to a literal halt. Motorized columns that once covered 50 miles a day now struggle to advance 5 miles in 24 hours. The mud is an enemy that no amount of firepower can defeat. It clutches at the axles of the Opel Blitz trucks and suctions the boots off the marching infantry. The logistical impact of the mud is catastrophic for an army that relies on a tenuous supply chain stretching back to Poland. Fuel tankers sink to their chassis in the mire, leaving the panzer divisions stranded without gas in the middle of nowhere. Horse-drawn wagons, which still make up the vast bulk of the German logistics train, fare even worse. The poor animals collapse from exhaustion as they try to drag artillery pieces through the sludge, their carcasses lining the roads as grim mile markers. The Luftwaffe attempts to drop supplies by air, but the weather grounds the planes, leaving the forward units starving for ammunition and food just as the resistance stiffens. Compounding the misery is the fundamental failure of the German railway engineers to adapt the Soviet rail network to their needs. The Russian rail gauge is slightly wider than the European standard, meaning German trains cannot run on captured Soviet tracks without extensive modification. This bottleneck creates a logistical heart attack. Mountains of winter clothing, fuel, and ammunition pile up at depots in Poland and Brest-Litovsk. Unable to reach the shivering soldiers at the front, the men of the Wehrmacht are fighting at the end of a tether that is fraying with every passing day, forced to scavenge for food in a countryside that has been scorched by the retreating enemy. As the advance slows to a crawl, the German soldier begins to realize that he has been lied to about the nature of this war. They were promised a quick summer campaign, yet here they are, shivering in light cotton summer tunics as the temperature begins to dip toward freezing. There are no winter coats, no felt boots, no antifreeze for the vehicles. The arrogance of the High Command, who believed the war would be over before the first snowflake fell, now condemns millions of men to suffer the elements without protection. Morale begins to crack as the soldiers realize they are trapped in a hostile land with winter approaching like an executioner. On the other side of the line, the mud provides a godsend for the Red Army, buying them time when they are on the brink of collapse. General Georgy Zhukov, summoned from Leningrad by Stalin to save the capital, uses the pause to reorganize the shattered defenses. He ruthlessly scrapes together every available man factory workers, police battalions, cadets, and throws them into the line to plug the gaps. More importantly, intelligence from Richard Sorge in Tokyo confirms that Japan will not attack the Soviet East, allowing Stalin to transfer hardy Siberian divisions from the Manchurian border to the gates of Moscow. These are fresh troops, equipped for winter warfare, waiting in the wings. By early November, the temperature drops sharply, freezing the mud into solid ground. The German generals breathe a sigh of relief as mobility returns, and the tanks can once again roll forward over the hardened earth. However, This freeze is a double-edged sword. While the ground is hard, the air is becoming lethally cold, and the Wehrmacht is totally unprepared for it. Engines refuse to start in the sub-zero mornings, requiring fires to be lit under the oil pans to thaw them out. Machine guns jam as the lubricating oil turns to paste, and soldiers suffer from frostbite in their summer leather boots. General Guderian, leading the southern pincer toward the industrial city of Tula, finds his advance blocked not just by the cold, but by a resurgent enemy. Tula is a fortress city, and the workers have turned the factories into strongpoints. The German tanks, low on fuel and ammunition, throw themselves against the defenses, but are repelled by Soviet anti-tank guns and T-34 seconds. The failure to take Tula means the southern flank of the attack on Moscow is exposed, forcing Guderian to spread his depleted forces dangerously thin. The German offensive is losing its cohesion, fragmenting into isolated battle groups trying to punch through a wall that is growing thicker by the hour. The human cost of the advance is etched into the faces of the German soldiers, who now bear the 1,000-yard stare of men pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Dysentery and typhus rampages through the ranks, spread by the lice that infest every seam of their uniforms. They sleep in the open or in burned-out hovels, huddled together for warmth, eating frozen bread hacked apart with bayonets. The letters home cease to boast of victory and instead speak of a profound, existential dread. They are fighting an enemy that seems to grow out of the very earth, in a land that is actively trying to kill them. As November draws to a close, the lead elements of the German 2nd Panzer Division reach the town of Krasnaya Polyana, just nearly 20 miles from the Kremlin. Through their binoculars, the reconnaissance officers can see the spires of Moscow shimmering in the frosty air. They are tantalizingly close enough to see the objective for which they have marched 1,000 miles and bled 1,000,000 men. But their tanks are running on fumes, their guns are almost empty, and the thermometer is plummeting to 30 degrees below zero. They have reached the high-water mark of the Third Reich, but they have no strength left to take the final step. The halt at the gates of Moscow is not just a tactical pause, it is the death knell of the Blitzkrieg strategy. The concept of the Lightning War relied on a quick, decisive knockout blow, but the Soviet Union is still standing, battered but defiant. The logistical tether has snapped, the strategic timeline is broken, and the German army is stranded in the white hell of the Russian winter. As the first heavy blizzards begin to bury the landscape, a terrifying silence falls over the front, broken only by the howling wind and the growing rumble of Soviet engines gathering in the east. The hunter has become the hunted. December 5, 1941. The temperature on the outskirts of Moscow plummets to a staggering 35 degrees below zero. A cold so absolute that it feels less like weather and more like a physical assault. In the foxholes of the German army, the soldiers of Army Group Center are no longer fighting for the capture of the Soviet capital. They are fighting simply to exist for one more hour. The lubricating oil in their weapons has turned into a glue-like paste, rendering bolt-action rifles and machine guns useless unless they are urinated on to thaw the mechanisms. Bread rations arrive frozen as solid as bricks, requiring axes to chop them into edible shards, while the engines of the tanks must be kept running continuously or lit with fires underneath just to prevent the blocks from cracking. The German offensive, Operation Typhoon, has reached its terminal point of exhaustion just 19 miles from the Kremlin. Reconnaissance units from the 2nd Panzer Division claim they can see the golden domes of the cathedrals through their binoculars, shimmering like a mirage in the frosty air. Yet, this visual confirmation is a cruel taunt, for the Wehrmacht lacks the fuel, ammunition, and manpower to traverse those final miles. The infantry companies are skeletal shadows of their former selves, reduced to 20 or 30 men, shivering in thin denim combat tunics designed for a summer campaign that was supposed to end months ago. Frostbite is now claiming more casualties than Soviet bullets, turning fingers and toes black with gangrenous necrosis that requires amputation without anesthesia. Inside the Kremlin, the mood has shifted from desperate anxiety to cold, calculated aggression. Joseph Stalin and his top general, Georgy Zhukov, have held their nerve, keeping their strategic reserves hidden in the forests east of the city, while the Germans bled themselves white against the outer defences. Now, the trap is ready to be sprung. The intelligence from Richard Sorge has held true. Japan is not attacking the east, allowing the Soviets to deploy the Siberian divisions. These are fresh, well-fed troops, equipped with quilted winter uniforms, fur hats, and felt boots called valenki that keep their feet warm in the deepest snow. They are masters of winter warfare, trained to fight on skis and survive in conditions that are killing the invaders. At dawn on December 5, the silence of the frozen front is shattered not by German artillery, but by the roar of the Red Army. The Soviet counteroffensive begins on a massive front stretching from Kalinin in the north to Yelets in the south, catching the Germans completely unprepared. The attack is spearheaded by the T-34 tanks, painted in whitewash camouflage that makes them invisible against the snow until they are terrifyingly close. Unlike the German panzers, whose narrow tracks sink helplessly into the deep drifts, the T-34 seconds have wide tracks that allow them to glide over the snow, maneuvering with a speed and agility that shocks the frozen German defenders. The psychological impact of the Soviet assault is immediate and devastating. The German soldiers, who have been told for months that the Red Army is broken and demoralized, suddenly find themselves facing wave after wave of aggressive infantry shouting "Ura" as they charge through the mist. The German defensive lines, thinly stretched and lacking heavy weapons, buckle under the pressure. Panic, a sensation previously unknown to the disciplined Wehrmacht, begins to ripple through the ranks. Units that have never known defeat suddenly find themselves outflanked and cut off, forcing them to abandon their heavy equipment and flee westward into the snowy wasteland. For the first time in World War II, the German war machine is not advancing, it is retreating in disarray. The roads leading west become graveyards of the blitzkrieg. Thousands of vehicles, their engines frozen or out of fuel, are abandoned by their crews, who join the trudging columns of infantry trying to escape the Soviet encirclement. Artillery pieces, the pride of the German army, are spiked and left behind in the drifts. The retreat is a nightmare of logistics and morale, as the Luftwaffe struggles to provide air cover in the blinding blizzards, and the wounded are often left behind to the mercy of the advancing Soviets or the freezing temperatures. In the Wolf's Lair, the news of the Soviet counteroffensive hits Adolf Hitler like a physical blow. The Führer, who had declared to the world in October that the Soviet Union was struck down and would never rise again, is now faced with the prospect of a catastrophic collapse similar to Napoleon's retreat in 1812. His generals, including Guderian and Bock, beg for permission to conduct a strategic withdrawal to a shorter, defensible line further west, arguing that trying to hold the current exposed positions will lead to the destruction of the army. They plead for operational freedom to save their men from the encirclement that threatens to swallow Army Group Center. Hitler's response is instantaneous and furious. He views the requests for retreat as a sign of cowardice and a lack of National Socialist will. On December 16, he issues his famous halt order, commanding the troops to stand fast and fanatically defend every inch of ground. Not a step back, he screams at his generals over the telephone. He orders the soldiers to dig in where they stand, even if they have to blast foxholes into the frozen earth with hand grenades. He strips the generals of their commands, firing Guderian, Höpner, and eventually Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, appointing himself as the commander-in-chief of the army. The halt order is a controversial decision that historians will debate for decades. But in the immediate chaos of December 1941, it likely saves the Wehrmacht from total disintegration. By forbidding a general retreat, Hitler forces the army to stand and fight, preventing the panic from turning into a chaotic rout. The German soldiers, terrified of their own leadership as much as the enemy, form hedgehogs' fortified strongpoints in villages and towns where they hold out against the Soviet tide with desperate tenacity. They fight with their backs to the wall, knowing that retreat means court-martial and execution, while surrender means death in a Soviet labor camp. However, the cost of this stabilization is horrific. The German army suffers casualties on a scale that bleeds the life out of the infantry divisions. During that terrible winter, the Wehrmacht suffers over 1 million casualties from combat and frostbite. The elite formations that marched into Russia in June are gone, replaced by hastily trained conscripts and drafted older men. The horses that pulled the supply wagons are dead, eaten by the starving troops, and the motorized transport fleet is largely destroyed. The army that survives the winter of 1941 is a hardened, cynical force, stripped of its illusions of invincibility. The Soviet offensive continues to hammer the German lines throughout January and February 1942, pushing the front line back nearly 150 miles in some sectors. Zhukov, sensing blood, urges his forces forward, trying to encircle the entirety of Army Group Center. However, the Red Army is also exhausting itself. The logistical difficulties of supplying an offensive in deep winter, combined with the stubborn German hedgehog defense, eventually bring the Soviet advance to a halt. The Soviets have saved Moscow and inflicted a massive defeat on Germany, but they lack the strength to deliver the knockout blow. As the spring thaw of 1942 approaches, bringing a return of the mud and a temporary lull in the fighting, the strategic reality of the war has fundamentally changed. The concept of blitzkrieg, the lightning war of rapid movement and quick victory, is dead, buried in the snows outside Moscow. Germany is now locked in a war of attrition, a long, grinding struggle against an enemy with superior manpower and resources. The quick victory that Hitler gambled his entire regime on has evaporated. The failure to take Moscow is the turning point of the war. From this moment on, Germany is fighting a defensive war against a giant that has fully awakened. The psychological scars on the German survivors are permanent. They have looked into the abyss of the East and seen the vastness of the challenge facing them. They know now that the propaganda was a lie. The Soviet soldier is not a primitive subhuman who will run at the first shot, but a tough, resilient fighter defending his homeland with ferocious courage. The German soldier has learned to fear the Russian winter, the T-34 tank, and the endless reserves of the Red Army. The arrogance of June 1941 is replaced by a grim determination to survive. As the realization sets in that the road home is getting longer and darker, meanwhile, behind the lines, the true horror of the Nazi war of annihilation continues unabated. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads following the army, continue their systematic murder of Jews, commissars, and civilians, ensuring that the population in the occupied territories will never accept German rule. This brutality backfires spectacularly, driving thousands of Soviet citizens into the forests to join the partisan bands. These partisans begin to wreak havoc on the German supply lines, blowing up trains and ambushing convoys, creating a second front behind the German lines that further strangles the already desperate logistics of the Wehrmacht. Back in Berlin, the Nazi propaganda machine shifts its narrative. The war is no longer presented as a glorious crusade of conquest, but as a defense of European civilization against the Bolshevik hordes. Goebbels calls for total war, asking the German people to sacrifice winter clothing and furs for the soldiers at the front. The mood in Germany darkens as the death notices begin to arrive in every village and town. The illusion of a cost-free war is shattered. The Battle of Moscow has proven that the Third Reich is mortal, and for the first time, the shadow of ultimate defeat begins to creep into the minds of the German people. The winter of 1941 to 1942 ends with the front line stabilized. But the initiative has been lost. The German army is still a formidable fighting force, capable of launching dangerous offensives, but it will never again possess the overwhelming superiority it enjoyed in the summer of 1941. The failure at Moscow is the fatal error realized. The gamble has failed. Now, the war shifts south, towards the oil fields of the Caucasus and a city on the Volga River named Stalingrad, where the tragedy of the Eastern Front will reach its bloody crescendo. The spring of 1942 brings a deceptive warmth to the Eastern Front, thawing the frozen corpses of the previous winter and drying the mud that had swallowed the Wehrmacht's momentum. In the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler spreads a fresh map across the table, his eyes no longer fixed on Moscow but drifting south toward the shimmering heat of the Caucasus. He has convinced himself that the failure to take the Soviet capital was merely a setback, not a defeat, and now unveils Case Blue, a massive strategic pivot designed to seize the oil fields of Baku and Grozny. Without this oil, he argues, The German war machine will grind to a halt. With it, the Third Reich will be invincible. To execute this ambitious plan, Army Group South is split into two erratic prongs. Army Group A, tasked with driving deep into the Caucasus Mountains, and Army Group B, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, ordered to secure the flank by capturing a city on the Volga River. The city bears the name of the Soviet dictator Stalingrad. Initially, the city is merely a tactical objective, a point on a map to be neutralized to protect the oil supply lines. However, as the summer progresses, the name Stalingrad begins to exert a magnetic, obsessive pull on Hitler's psyche. The strategic necessity of oil is slowly replaced by the symbolic necessity of crushing the city that bears Stalin's name. On August 23, 1942, the German Fourth Air Fleet, under the command of General Wolfram von Richthofen, unleashes a bombardment of apocalyptic proportions upon Stalingrad. Over 600 bombers turn the city into a sprawling inferno in a matter of hours, dropping thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The wooden residential districts are incinerated, killing 40,000 civilians in a single afternoon and sending a plume of black smoke thousands of feet into the air that is visible for miles. The Volga River itself seems to catch fire as oil storage tanks rupture, spilling burning fuel onto the water where ferries are desperately trying to evacuate the wounded. However, this massive aerial destruction proves to be a grievous tactical error for the Germans. By reducing the city to rubble, the Luftwaffe has inadvertently created the perfect defensive terrain for the Soviet 62nd Army. The streets, once wide enough for German tanks to maneuver, are now choked with debris, forcing the panzers to navigate through narrow, predictable kill zones. Every ruined building, every cellar, and every pile of twisted steel becomes a fortress for Soviet infantry. The German doctrine of blitzkrieg, which relies on speed, maneuver, and open space, is rendered useless here. The battle for Stalingrad will not be a war of movement, but a Rattenkrieg, a war of rats, inside the ruins. General Vasily Chuikov takes command of the Soviet defense with a ruthlessness that matches the stakes. He realizes that the Germans have superior air power and artillery, so he implements a tactical doctrine known as hugging the enemy. He orders his troops to keep their front lines no more than 50 yards from the German positions, often occupying the floor directly below or above the enemy. This proximity renders the Luftwaffe impotent, as German pilots cannot bomb Soviet positions without killing their own men. The battle devolves into a series of vicious, close-quarters brawls fought with submachine guns, sharpened shovels, and knives in smoke-filled hallways. The fighting centers around key landmarks that acquire mythical status in the annals of warfare: the grain elevator, the tractor factory, and the Barricade gun factory. At the grain elevator, a massive concrete structure dominating the skyline, a handful of Soviet guards hold off an entire German division for days. The concrete silos echo with the deafening roar of grenades and machine gun fire as the Germans fight floor by floor, often in total darkness, choking on grain, dust, and smoke. When they finally capture the structure, they find only a few dozen burnt and bloody defenders, a testament to the fanaticism of the resistance. The psychological toll on the German soldiers of the Sixth Army is profound and shattering. These men, accustomed to sweeping victories across Europe, find themselves trapped in a meat grinder where the average life expectancy of a reinforcement is measured in hours. Letters home describe the city as a mass grave and the fighting as a descent into madness. They capture the kitchen of a house only to fight for the living room for another 2 days. Battalions are reduced to companies, and companies to squads. The exhaustion is absolute. Yet the orders from Paulus are relentless: push forward to the Volga, no matter the cost. By November 1942, the Germans have captured 90% of the city, reaching the banks of the Volga in several places and splitting the Soviet defense into isolated pockets. They have technically won the battle for the city, but in doing so, they have exhausted their reserves and dangerously overextended their flanks. The flanks of the Sixth Army, stretching for hundreds of miles across the open steppe, are guarded not by German troops, but by ill-equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies. These Allied units lack heavy anti-tank weapons and morale, a weakness that the Soviet High Command has been observing with predatory patience. Deep in the Soviet rear, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky have been preparing a masterstroke codenamed Operation Uranus, while Chuikov fed the German meat grinder in the city to pin down the Sixth Army. Zhukov secretly amassed over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces on the weak flanks of the German salient, moving only at night and under strict radio silence. The Red Army positions itself for a classic pincer movement. The German intelligence services, blinded by their focus on the city fighting, fail to detect the massive build-up until it is too late. On the morning of November 19, a thick, freezing fog hangs over the steppe northwest of Stalingrad, obscuring the horizon. At 0720, the silence is broken by the thunder of 3,500 Soviet guns and mortars opening fire simultaneously. The barrage obliterates the Romanian frontline positions, creating a chaotic vacuum that the Soviet T-34 seconds rush to fill. The Romanian soldiers, terrified and outgunned, break and run, allowing the Soviet armor to pour into the German rear. The following day, a similar attack is launched from the south, shattering the Romanian Fourth Army. The two steel arms of the Soviet offensive race toward the town of Kalach behind the Sixth Army. On November 23, the two Soviet pincers meet at the bridge in Kalach, sealing the trap. Inside the Kessel, or cauldron, nearly 300,000 men of the German Sixth Army and elements of the Fourth Panzer Army are completely surrounded. General Paulus requests immediate permission to break out while his army still has fuel and strength, to punch through the encirclement and retreat west. But Hitler, obsessed with the prestige of the city, refuses. He assures Paulus that the Sixth Army can hold out in Fortress Stalingrad and be supplied by air until a relief force can break through to them. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, arrogantly promises Hitler that his air force can deliver the 500 tons of daily supplies needed to keep the Sixth Army alive. It is a fatal lie born of vanity. The Luftwaffe has neither the transport planes nor the infrastructure to maintain such an airlift in the brutal Russian winter. In reality, the daily average of supplies delivered is barely 100 tons, a fraction of what is needed. The soldiers inside the Kessel begin to starve. The daily ration is cut to a few ounces of bread and a slice of horse meat, while ammunition stocks dwindle to critical levels. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launches Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet ring and rescue the Sixth Army. His panzer divisions fight their way to within 30 miles of the pocket, close enough that the trapped soldiers can see the flashes of the artillery on the horizon at night. But Paulus, adhering strictly to Hitler's orders, refuses to disobey and launch a breakout attempt to meet the rescuers. The Soviet resistance stiffens, and Manstein is forced to withdraw to prevent his own forces from being encircled. The door to the cage slams shut forever. As Christmas 1942 descends on the Kessel, the conditions inside are a vision of hell. The temperature drops to 30 degrees below zero. Soldiers, skeletal from starvation and rampant dysentery, huddle in dugouts wrapped in rags, waiting to die. The Stalingrad stiffness becomes a common cause of death. Men simply sit down to rest and freeze solid within minutes. The airfields at Pitomnik and Gumrak, the army's only lifelines, are overrun by the tightening Soviet noose, ending the evacuation of the wounded. Despair replaces discipline. Suicide becomes common, and reports of cannibalism begin to whisper through the ranks. By January 1943, the Soviet forces launch Operation Ring. The final liquidation of the pocket, the Sixth Army, is split into two smaller pockets, and the end is inevitable. On January 30, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Hitler promotes Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The message is implicit but clear: no German Field Marshal has ever been taken alive. Hitler expects Paulus to commit suicide and become a martyr for the Reich. It is a final act of cynical manipulation from a leader who has abandoned his army to a frozen death. Paulus, however, has lost his faith in the Führer. On January 31, Soviet troops enter the basement of the Uvermag department store, the makeshift headquarters of the Sixth Army. They find the new field marshal lying on a cot, unshaven and defeated. surrounded by the stench of unwashed bodies and disinfectant. He does not reach for his pistol. Instead, he surrenders. 2 days later, the northern pocket capitulates. The guns finally fall silent over the ruins of Stalingrad, ending one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The aftermath is a scene of staggering devastation. Of the nearly 300,000 men trapped in the Kessel, over 140,000 have died from combat, starvation, or cold. The remaining 91,000, including 22 generals, begin a long, deathly march into Soviet captivity. They shuffle past the frozen corpses of their comrades, heads bowed, stripped of their arrogance and their illusions. Of these 91,000 prisoners, only 5,000 will ever see Germany again, and that will be more than a decade later. Stalingrad is the psychological turning point of World War II. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility is shattered irrevocably. For the first time, a German field army has been not just defeated, but annihilated. The news sends a shockwave through the German population, who are forced into 3 days of national mourning. The initiative has passed to the Red Army, which will never relinquish it. The road to Berlin is now open, paved with the wreckage of the Sixth Army, and the long retreat that began in the ruins of the Volga will not end until the red flag flies over the Reichstag. The spring of 1943 settles over the Eastern Front with a tense, ominous quiet, broken only by the sporadic crack of sniper fire and the distant rumble of reconnaissance patrols. The disaster at Stalingrad has left a gaping wound in the Wehrmacht, yet the German line has miraculously stabilized, thanks to the defensive genius of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. However, looking at the map table in the Wolf's Lair, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines protrudes westward around the city of Kursk, a salient nearly 150 miles wide. To the German High Command, this bulge represents both a mortal threat and a tantalizing opportunity to regain the initiative that was lost in the snows of the Volga. The plan conceived to eliminate this threat is codenamed Operation Citadel. The strategy is classically German, a simultaneous pincer attack from the north and south to cut off the salient at its base, encircling and destroying the massive concentration of Soviet forces trapped inside. On paper, it is a sound operational concept intended to shorten the German front line and free up precious reserves for the Western Front. However, the plan suffers from a fatal flaw that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome. It is painfully obvious. Every officer on both sides of the line knows exactly where the attack must come. There is no room for surprise or deception in the geography of Kursk. While Manstein urges an immediate attack in May as soon as the ground dries, arguing that speed is their only advantage, Adolf Hitler hesitates. The Führer is obsessed with technical superiority and refuses to launch the offensive until his new wonder weapons are ready in sufficient numbers. He places his faith in the heavy Tiger I tank, the massive Ferdinand tank destroyer, and the sleek new Panther medium tank, believing these steel monsters will crush the Soviet defenses effortlessly. This decision leads to a catastrophic delay, pushing the start date from May to June, and finally to July. During these critical months of delay, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, is not idle. Forewarned by British intelligence and the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky know the exact German plans. They decide on a strategy of premeditated defense, let the Germans smash themselves against prepared positions, bleed them white, and then launch a crushing counteroffensive. They transform the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position in the history of warfare. 300,000 civilians are mobilized to dig thousands of miles of trenches, laying over 400,000 mines and creating deep anti-tank ditches that scar the landscape for miles. When the German offensive finally begins on July 5, 1943, the element of surprise is non-existent. In fact, the Soviets launch a spoiling artillery bombardment just minutes before the German attack is scheduled to start, catching the Wehrmacht in their assembly areas. As the German Ninth Army under General Walter Model attacks from the north and the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth pushes from the south, they do not find the open steppe they crave. Instead, they drive straight into a meat grinder of pack fronts' concentrated nests of anti-tank guns, commanded to fire volleys at single targets and minefields so dense that engineers have to clear them by hand under heavy fire. In the northern sector, Model's advance is a brutal slog that bogs down almost immediately. His heavy Ferdinand tank destroyers, formidable beasts with 88mm guns and 8 inches of frontal armor, prove to be tactically flawed. Lacking machine guns for close defense, they are swarmed by Soviet infantry, who disable them with satchel charges and Molotov cocktails. The fighting centers around the railway station at Ponyry, which becomes a miniature Stalingrad. The Germans capture the station, lose it, and capture it again in a seesaw battle of attrition that consumes the infantry reserves Model needs for a breakthrough. After a week of heavy fighting, the northern pincer has advanced only a few miles and is totally spent. In the south, the progress is more promising but equally costly. The elite SS Panzer Corps, comprised of the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, manages to punch through the 1st and 2nd Soviet defensive belts. The fighting here is characterized by a level of ferocity that shocks even the veterans of 1941. The open rolling grasslands of the steppe allow for long-range tank duels, where the superior optics of the German Tigers take a heavy toll on the Soviet T-34 However, for every Soviet tank destroyed, another seems to emerge from the dust. The German spearheads are bleeding fuel and men with every mile gained, forcing Hoth to commit his reserves just to keep the momentum going. By July 11, the 4th Panzer Army has broken through the main defensive lines and turns northeast toward the small town of Prokhorovka, hoping to break out into the open country beyond. Sensing the danger, the Soviet command releases its strategic reserve, the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov. On July 12, the two massive armored forces collide on the fields outside Prokhorovka. It is not a single coherent battle but a chaotic series of swirling engagements involving nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, fought under a scorching summer sun that turns the inside of the vehicles into ovens. The Battle of Prokhorovka becomes a legendary clash of steel, a chaotic melee where tactical finesse is replaced by brute force. The Soviet T-34 realizing they cannot penetrate the frontal armor of the Tigers at long range, charge forward at full speed, closing the distance to point-blank range in a suicidal death ride. The battlefield disappears under a shroud of black smoke, dust, and flames. Tanks ram each other, firing shells at ranges of less than 50 yards. Turrets are blown off by the force of internal explosions, and crews bail out of burning machines to fight with pistols and knives in the tall grass. Although the Germans tactically win the engagement at Prokhorovka by destroying more Soviet tanks than they lose, the strategic result is a Soviet victory. The Red Army can afford the losses, the Wehrmacht cannot. The German armored spearhead is blunted, its momentum halted dead in its tracks. The psychological impact of seeing hundreds of burning German tanks littered across the steppe is devastating. The myth of the superiority of the Panzerwaffe is shattered. The German commanders, looking at their depleted fuel gauges and ammunition racks, realize that the breakthrough they sacrificed so much for is now impossible. Far away in the Mediterranean, another event drives the final nail into the coffin of Operation Citadel. On July 10, Allied forces land in Sicily, opening a new front in southern Europe. Hitler, panicked by the collapse of his Italian ally, summons Manstein to the Wolf's Lair on July 13 and orders the immediate cancellation of the Kursk offensive. He announces that the IISS Panzer Corps must be withdrawn and sent to Italy to bolster the defense there. Manstein is furious, arguing that victory is still within reach if they continue the attack. But his protests fall on deaf ears. The decision is made. The greatest gamble of 1943 is abandoned. The cancellation of Citadel marks the definitive turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. Unlike the defeat at Moscow or Stalingrad, where the Germans could claim they were beaten by the weather or encirclement, at Kursk they were beaten in a fair fight during the summer, with their best units and best equipment. They threw their maximum effort at the Soviet line and failed to break it. The initiative passes permanently to the Red Army. From this day forward, the Wehrmacht will never launch another major strategic offensive in the East. They are doomed to react to Soviet moves, retreating step by bloody step toward the German border. The Soviet reaction is immediate and overwhelming. Even before the dust has settled at Prokhorovka, the Red Army launches Operation Kutuzov to the north and Operation Rumyantsev to the south. The exhausted German units, still reeling from the failure of their own attack, are suddenly hit by fresh Soviet armies numbering in the millions. The cities of Orel and Belgorod are liberated in early August, followed swiftly by Kharkov, the German front line, so carefully reconstructed by Manstein over the winter, begins to disintegrate under the relentless hammer blows of the Soviet steamroller. As the summer turns to autumn, the German retreat becomes a race for the Dnieper River. The next major defensive barrier, the scorched earth policy, is implemented with renewed ruthlessness. German rearguards burn villages, destroy bridges, and tear up railway tracks to slow the Soviet advance. But the Red Army is learning. They are becoming masters of deep operations, using mechanized corps to bypass German strongpoints and threaten encirclement, forcing the Wehrmacht to abandon defensible terrain or risk another Stalingrad. The German soldier, retreating past the graves of his comrades from the summer offensive, knows that the war is lost. By late 1943, the strategic collapse is undeniable. The eastern wall along the Dnieper is breached by Soviet forces in a daring amphibious operation before the Germans can fully man the defenses. Kiev is liberated in November, sending a wave of jubilation through the Allied nations. The fatal error of delaying the attack at Kursk, of underestimating the Soviet capacity for defense and regeneration, has sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The German army is now a broken shield, unable to stop the vengeful sword that is swinging toward the heart of Germany. The long, agonizing road to Berlin lies open. June 22, 1944. It is the third anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a date etched in blood and irony. The Eastern Front has been relatively quiet for months, a deceptive calm that hangs heavy over the swamps of Belorussia. The German High Command, deceived by a brilliant Soviet deception campaign known as Maskirovka, is entirely convinced that the next major blow will fall in the south, toward the oil fields of Ukraine. Consequently, they have stripped Army Group Center of its armor and reserves, sending them south to wait for an attack that will never come. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding the center, sits confidently in his headquarters, unaware that he is guarding the gates of hell with a skeleton key. At dawn, the sky over Belorussia is torn apart by the most massive artillery bombardment of the war. Operation Barbarossa begins not with a whimper, but with a seismic roar as thousands of Soviet guns, rocket launchers, and heavy mortars pulverize the German defensive lines. The barrage is so intense that it obliterates entire battalions before they can reach their battle stations. Following the steel rain, 4 Soviet fronts, numbering nearly 2.5 million men and 6,000 tanks, surge forward. They do not attack the strongpoints directly but flow around them like water, utilizing the deep battle doctrine to encircle and isolate the German defenders in vast pockets. The collapse of Army Group Center is swift, total, and catastrophic. Within weeks, the German front line simply ceases to exist, torn open by a gap nearly 250 miles wide. 28 German divisions are encircled and annihilated, a disaster that dwarfs the loss at Stalingrad. The roads leading west are clogged with panicked columns of retreating troops, horses, and vehicles, all strafed mercilessly by the Red Air Force, which now rules the skies. The command structure disintegrates, generals are captured in their pajamas, and entire corps disappear from the map without a trace. The backbone of the Wehrmacht in the east is broken. In a grim display of triumph, Joseph Stalin orders a parade of the vanquished through the streets of Moscow on July 17, 1944. 57,000 filthy, emaciated German prisoners, including dozens of generals, are marched through the capital under the gaze of silent, stone-faced Soviet citizens. Behind the shuffling columns, water trucks spray the asphalt, a symbolic gesture to wash away the filth of the fascist invaders. It is a humiliation that signals to the world the irreversible shift in the war's fortunes. The road to Berlin is no longer a strategic concept, it is a physical reality, and the Red Army is driving down it at full speed. By August 1944, the Soviet advance reaches the Vistula River, just across from Warsaw. The speed of the advance over 400 miles in 5 weeks exhausts the Soviet logistical tail, forcing a pause. Across the river, the Polish Home Army launches the Warsaw Uprising, hoping to liberate their capital before the Soviets arrive. However, Stalin, with cynical calculation, orders his troops to halt and wait, allowing the SS to brutally crush the Polish resistance and raze the city to the ground. This pause allows the Germans to briefly stabilize their line, but it is the stability of a corpse before rigor mortis sets in. The end is not in doubt, it is merely delayed. As the winter of 1945 descends, the war finally crosses the borders of the Reich itself. In East Prussia, the civilians who once cheered the news of victories in 1941 now flee in terror before the advancing red steamroller. The propaganda of Goebbels, which depicted the Soviets as subhuman monsters, now backfires, creating a panic that clogs the roads with millions of refugees. Tales of the atrocities committed at Nemmersdorf spread like wildfire, fueling a desperate, fanatical resistance born of pure fear. The German soldier is no longer fighting for the Führer or for conquest. He is fighting to buy time for his family to escape to the west. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launches the Vistula-Oder offensive, a display of military power that defies imagination. Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev unleash a juggernaut that smashes through the German lines in Poland like a tidal wave. The German defense is brittle once the crust is broken. There are no reserves behind it. Soviet tank armies bypass strongholds, driving up to 40 miles a day. Racing over the frozen plains, they cross the Oder River, the last natural barrier before Berlin, and establish bridgeheads just 40 miles from the German capital. The panic in Berlin is palpable as the rumble of Soviet artillery can be heard on quiet nights. April 16, 1945. The Battle of Berlin begins at the Silo Heights. Marshal Zhukov, under immense pressure from Stalin to take the city before the Americans, illuminates the battlefield with 140 searchlights, intending to blind the defenders. However, the light reflects off the smoke and dust, silhouetting the attacking Soviet troops. The German commander, General Gotthard Heinrici, a master of defensive warfare, has withdrawn his troops from the front trenches just before the artillery barrage, leaving the Soviets to shell empty ground. The initial Soviet assault is a slaughter, but the sheer weight of numbers and steel eventually grinds through the defense. The dike bursts, and the floodwaters pour toward the city. By April 20, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, the Soviet artillery begins to shell the center of Berlin. The city, once the jewel of the Reich, is a landscape of apocalyptic ruin. The remaining defenders are a motley collection of shattered SS units, Wehrmacht stragglers, and the Volkssturm battalions of old men and teenage boys armed with panzerfausts. These children, some as young as 12, are tasked with stopping the T-34 seconds in the rubble of their own neighborhoods. They fight with a fanaticism that horrifies the battle-hardened Soviet veterans, who find themselves killing children to survive. Inside the Führer bunker, buried deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler moves imaginary armies on a map that no longer reflects reality. He screams orders to General Felix Steiner to launch a counterattack that exists only in his mind. His hands tremble uncontrollably, his eyes are glazed, and he rails against the betrayal of the German people, claiming they have failed him. Above ground, the reality is the Tiergarten being turned into an artillery park and the sounds of machine gun fire echoing in the corridors of the subway system, where thousands of civilians cower in the dark. The noose tightens around the government district. On April 30, with Soviet troops just a few hundred yards away, fighting room to room in the ruins of the Reichstag, Hitler acknowledges the end. He marries his mistress, Eva Braun, in a surreal, somber ceremony, then dictates his final political testament, blaming the Jews for the war. That afternoon, a single gunshot echoes through the bunker. The man who unleashed the greatest slaughter in human history takes the coward's way out, biting a cyanide capsule and shooting himself in the temple. His body is carried up to the Chancellery garden, doused in petrol, and burned as Soviet shells churn the earth around it. The fight for the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of the Third Reich, is a brutal, medieval struggle. Soviet soldiers fight their way up the staircase, hurling grenades and engaging in hand-to-hand combat in the burning halls. On May 2, 1945, a soldier named Abdul Kakim Ismailov raises the red flag over the shattered dome of the building, a scene immortalized in one of the most famous photographs of the century. The image of the hammer and sickle flying over the ruined capital of Nazi Germany signals the definitive end of the nightmare. The guns finally fall silent on May 8, 1945. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signs the instrument of unconditional surrender in Berlin, formally ending the war in Europe. The silence that follows is deafening. It spreads across a continent that has been turned into a graveyard. The fatal era of June 1941 has run its full, bloody course. The invasion that was supposed to last 3 months has lasted nearly 4 years, claiming the lives of 27 million Soviet citizens and over 4 million German soldiers. As the smoke clears over the ruins of Europe, the scale of the tragedy becomes fully visible. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared army in existence, has been utterly destroyed. The 1,000-year Reich has lasted only 12 years, leaving behind a legacy of genocide and destruction unparalleled in history. The map of Europe is redrawn, with the Soviet Union emerging as a superpower standing amidst the rubble. The gamble for Lebensraum has resulted in the total occupation of Germany and the division of the world into 2 armed camps. In the end, the invasion of the Soviet Union stands as the ultimate lesson in hubris. It was a war of annihilation that turned back upon its instigators with biblical fury. The vast, unforgiving spaces of the East, which Hitler sought to conquer, instead became the graveyard of his army and his regime. The snows of Moscow, the ruins of Stalingrad, and the fields of Kursk were the milestones on a road that led inevitably to the bunker in Berlin. The fatal error was not just a military miscalculation, it was a moral abyss from which there was never any return.